Dr. Herting, welcome. I'm glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so Dr. Herting is a neuroscientist and a research or a professor in the University of Southern California's Department of Preventive Medicine. She researches the environmental effects on brain development and mental health outcomes. She also looks at hormone differences, sex differences, all that good stuff that we'll get into. And let's get started. How did you first get interested in neuroscience? Does this
So,
start in like early childhood, you or late in college?
yeah, that's a great question. I liked math and science fine in as an elementary school child, but I really didn't know about science and what science really meant and research really meant until I got to college, and I stumbled upon neuroscience in particular during some psychology requirement courses. So the funny thing about I'm a first generation faculty member. I guess that's the term. I kept saying
Mm-hmm.
college student, but now I guess there's a term, first generation faculty member. And so, I applied to school not really knowing what I was doing. Somehow I ended up in the economics or business school when I knew I wanted to do psychology. Don't know what happened there. But once I got to the University of Illinois, switched my major to psychology. And then the requirements included, some biological psychology, as they called it, which is really neuroscience. And so I had to take a couple of biological psychology courses to fill those credits. And I remember distinctly sitting in a lecture hall, and it was one of those intro biological psychology courses. So a couple of hundred of students, because U of I is very big, it's 40,000 undergrads.
Wow.
And we had a number of faculty who taught, they taught in like month and a half long segments. And they were just talking about really interesting things. I was always thinking about psychology. How do we feel? Or why do some individuals struggle with anxiety and depression? All of a sudden, there was like actual physical reasons why these things were happening. And this just seemed really amazing to me. They weren't theories, they were literally how are neurons changing related to X condition or Y condition. And it just really, sparked my interest that all of a sudden there was some tangible reason why things existed the way that everyone experienced them in daily life. And from that day forward, I really started to do more in terms of trying to find professors to do research with, trying to understand the biology. And that's how I ended up on the track for neuroscience.
It's very cool. So did you actually switch your major to neuroscience at that point, or were you still a psych major and you just became much more neuro focused?
Yeah, so we didn't have an undergrad degree in neuroscience then. I'm sure that they do now. So I just really focused. I just started taking all of the biological psychiatry and all the level biological psychiatry classes, and then started doing research in labs that were neuroscience labs.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned when you were younger, you didn't even really know what research was. So is this something that happened just through your courses? You obviously you learn about all the studies that go into everything you're learning. Or did you build a personal relationship with a professor and that's how you became involved in research?
So it's kind of embarrassing. The reason I even got into research, one is they kept saying, in case you want to continue to do school, you need research experience, whatever that meant. But two, I was told by an upper level student that if I got research experience, I could start getting paid to wash like the beakers in labs. And I had a lot of jobs during college, but it sounded really cool to be in a lab on my CV and also to get paid to wash beakers. And so
Mhm.
I started to just play around with doing research by signing up for those labs that people said, oh yeah, like my final year, I got paid to wash their beakers and do studies with them. Um, but I was lucky enough that, I found someone on the website, kind of picked someone at random based on their description. And his name was Bill Greenough, and he's very famous. He's passed away since, but very famous scientist in studying environmental enrichment. So if you put mice or rats in a cage with toys versus just keep them standardized, what was, essentially husbandry of mice back in the 70s, you saw prolific differences in their brain structure. And it was just really amazing. And that sounded really exciting to me, this idea that we weren't really you always hear about genetics, but this idea that we could really be that malleable in our brains seemed to really like stick, stick, you know, stick with me.
That's really cool. And going back to what you said about washing beakers, it's really funny that it seems like all of the paid lab positions are the most grunt worky ones, and the really fun ones where you get to do your own research are usually volunteer. So was it just that one lab that you were in all through undergrad, working with mice?
Primarily, I think I did a very quick like psychology research where I was running a couple of people. I essentially, for Psych 101, help the Psych 101 students come in and start an experiment on a computer laptop, right? And I did that maybe for half of a semester. Did what I was asked to do, but didn't really find it interesting. Didn't get to talk to the professor at all. I'm not even sure who trained me, but when I got into this other lab, I got paired with a postdoctoral fellow. And that was really exciting. She was the one that was having us read journal articles, which scared me to death, right? I was like, what am I doing? I don't know any of this. But it was really fun to think about, what we were studying, and I was feeling engaged where I hadn't in the other lab.
Yeah, taking, I hope this isn't an invasion of privacy, but I remember you slacked a couple of weeks ago. Like, I just wish I could have several weeks to catch up on all these articles I have to read, but which is such a transformation from going to being scared of these articles to wishing you had more free time for reading them.
I know, and it's funny, right? Because when I first started research in academia, it would take me forever to get through an article. Even the simplest ones, I think I had to read 3 times to be like, what does this mean? And it really is a learned skill. And I can totally understand why students in my class that I teach, where we go over primary literature together, are really overwhelmed because there's so much jargon. So I totally get it. But yes, there's just so much literature coming out these days. It's like every day I find 50 more articles I wish I had time to read, and I just can't. There's just not enough time in the day.
My favorite part has been watching the jargon slowly unscramble itself as I either become more familiar with a given area, or as I'll learn something new in a class that day, and then maybe a few days later I'll see it in some article and be like, I understand this now.
Yeah. Isn't it also really kind of insane that, we still are using so much jargon in what we do? I mean, we're all connected in ways that we weren't back then, right? You used to, also when I was an undergrad, you had to go to the library. One of the things I was asked to do is go to the library, look up the journals, look up the papers, and scan every article, right? Like Xerox copy articles out of big binders of books. And nowadays, everything's at our fingertips, and we've learned to communicate in ways I don't think we could imagine even 20 years ago, and yet we still have the very jargon to get at pretty simple simple ideas if we could just break it down for people.
Right. And it's really funny to think that journals used to literally mean journals, or maybe it still does. I guess some of them still send out magazines, but for me, my entire experience with it has been online, which is nice. It saves me from trips to the Xerox machine.
Yeah, absolutely. And stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of papers.
So how did you decide you wanted to go to graduate school? Was it just you wanted to keep learning, or you really enjoyed the research and you wanted to keep it going?
Yeah, I think it was definitely I wanted to keep learning. That's the one thing I can say has been consistent throughout my development as a human. I think one time, and I don't know when, someone asked me what I wanted to do, and I said I wanted to do something where I could just keep learning. And so I think academia is obviously that, right? It's the ability to continue to learn and pursue knowledge and education continuously. I mean, people are experts, but you're never really an expert at everything. There's always room to learn. But graduate school was actually, again, a decision about money. So when you get a psychology degree, they kind of fail, or maybe they do tell you, and I wasn't listening, that unless you wanted to go to grad school, you were probably looking to maybe become an administrative assistant. I don't know. I don't actually know what options you have as just a psychology degree anymore, but it was very clear that they weren't going to be psychology specific. And you would have a degree, but you weren't going to really do anything with that degree unless you went to grad school. And so, again, I had really great mentors who said, you should apply to grad school. And so, they took me under their wing, and I wrote my personal statement, and people looked at it, and, and I applied to a handful of grad school programs. But really, it was just a way to, I finally, instead of paying college money, like the idea that in at least neuroscience, you could get paid to continue your education was like, what? You mean this whole time? Like there's a path where I can keep learning and make a little bit of money. And it was probably about the amount you'd make if you just went out with a psychology degree. So again, I was like, well, I'm having fun. I'm not bad at this. Might as well just keep going and see where it heads. And so then I went to graduate school.
Yeah, although I'm sure it's definitely way more work than a similar easy job you could get with a psych degree. So was there any initial shock going from undergrad to grad school? You mentioned being a first gen student.
Yeah, I think so. So, PhD level program was farther than anyone in my family has ever gone on any side, right? And I felt like there was just all of a sudden graduate school is always like this. You're always, when you're a good student, you're like, okay, I'm good. I'm, especially elementary school, maybe you're A plus, and then middle school, you're
Elementary
like,
school is a star.
yeah, and you just keep going. And if you're a good student, you're a good student. You're like, okay, I'm doing great. Well, then you get to grad school, and you're really with all great students. They all are there for a reason. They all deserve to be there. In fact, lots of them probably deserve to be there that maybe didn't even make it in because there's that many great people, right? And so all of a sudden you're really around, some of the best and brightest. And so for me, it was like a little nerve-wracking to feel like I maybe didn't belong there. And so I had to struggle with that my first couple of years to convince myself I belonged there and I could do it. But I had a great mentor. I had a great PhD mentor. She was fantastic. And even the first semester into grad school, I went home to Illinois and came back and did my PhD in Oregon Health and Science University. And my mentor took all of us out in the lab for I think it was Christmas holiday or holiday break. She said, "What's up with you? You seem like less interested." And I had seriously went home thinking like, I'm going to go back and I'm going to quit. I can't do this. I'm going to quit. And I said, I'm really not sure I can do this. Like, I don't know if I can do this. And she's like, you can do this. And like, it was a heart to heart over like a holiday dinner. And I needed that. And so it was a hard transition, but it was worth it.
That's great. So what were you studying during that time? Was it still environmental focused or did that come later?
So that definitely came later. So I did animal work. We did the different rats in different cages for my undergrad, and then I also did a thesis project on a mouse model of Fragile X, which is the leading genetic cause of mental retardation. And then wanting to go into human work, the psychology in me wanted to work with humans, and I wanted to feel more connected to the human condition of individual differences and perspectives. So I went to graduate school, and I had the pleasure in that program to rotate. So I talk about this mentor who I ended up joining her lab, but the first year I actually rotated in a number of labs. So I rotated in her lab first, and then later through a non-human primate lab, and then another lab doing EEG, and came back to her lab because she was studying, multimodal neuroimaging in adolescents, and just really found, imaging really exciting. And I had a lot of coding, and that was the first time I started doing coding, and I really loved it. And so my whole PhD work was really focused on, the adolescent brain, the child brain using MRI modalities.
And what year was this, or years?
So grad school was not that long ago, 2007 to 2012.
Okay. Yeah, I was talking with Dr. Kaplan from USC. I don't know if you know him a couple days ago, and he was talking about how MRI was so new when he was getting into his research. But I'm like, no, Megan's not that old.
No, it wasn't that new per se. Although I do remind people, like the first time they applied human imaging to brain structure in children, and that was like groundbreaking work, was like 1999, like 2000. So I wasn't that far behind when they were at least applying this to children, but no, I'm much more junior than most professors, I think.
Yeah, but you still were or are, I guess, you get to be a pioneer of this relatively new technology. So that's very cool.
Yeah, it definitely, there's a lot for us to do and learn and improve on.
So did your dissertation then focus on some MRI study? What was that like?
Yeah, so my dissertation was based on animal work, and a little bit of an aging literature, about physical exercise and brain structure and function in adolescence. So my mentor, she had focused on risk for alcoholism. Like that's how she got all her money. And I had done some studies looking at genetic risk for alcoholism and brain structure. I did some sex differences work, but she kept pushing me to ask my own questions. And I came across this paper that I thought was really interesting, where rats who rats who drank alcohol had, neurotoxicity, but adolescent rats that drank alcohol and then ran on a running wheel seemed to have no differences than a normal control rat would have. And she wanted to study alcohol risk, and I told her, what if we just even see if brain plasticity with exercise in adolescence was a thing in humans? Because if that's true, then maybe later on, maybe if people are going to drink, maybe your message shouldn't be like, don't drink, which it should be if but maybe it should be, if you're going to drink, go for a run after, maybe not during. And so we somehow sold that to the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse as a training grant for me, saying that eventually she could look to see if it would be helpful for those that used alcohol. But first, proof of principle, we're going to just look to see if physical exercise related to brain in adolescence. And some aging work had already done that, right? Just like a couple of years before my dissertation. But nobody had, when I wrote the grant, nobody had done it in adolescence. And so that's what we did. We had some high fit and low fit kids. We had to define what that meant. We had them come and do like official aerobic fitness testing, which is very complex, where you actually make them run on a treadmill and measure all their oxygen utilization. And then study their brains within that week. And we saw structural differences in the hippocampus, which you'd expect from the animal literature. But we also saw functional differences in how they learned new memories with an fMRI paradigm. So it was a fun study.
Wow. So was it better memory in the exercise condition?
So it wasn't actually better memory. We were hoping for that, but it was actually that they recruited only one side of their hippocampus, whereas the low active kids really recruited both of their hippocampi and other substructures when learning new memories. So we had this really cool paradigm that I adapted and created. And it was event related. So you could literally look at what was the brain doing when you showed two word pairs and you're memorizing them, and you later could recall them successfully, so a half hour later, versus what was your brain doing when you were trying to learn two word pairs, but later didn't remember that pair. So you could kind of see what was the brain doing when you were successfully encoding versus not. Mm-hmm. And so it was the difference in the pattern of successful encoding that looked like they weren't using as much of their brain resources if they were more physically active.
So it's an efficiency thing.
I think so. Of course, it's cross-sectional. So I think an intervention study would be cool at some point to really show that it's, as you become more physically fit, maybe you have less need for as many resources. You're more efficient.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I was tying this back into the alcohol thing. It seems like frat houses hold some wisdom after all. Really funny.
Do they go for runs after they drink?
I was just thinking heavy drinking, but also heavy exercise.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The sad thing is, years later, I couldn't really find any replication of that study. So either someone didn't replicate it and they didn't publish it because of publishing bias, or no one's ever tried to replicate it. So who knows? Uh-huh. Maybe it was a weird finding.
Yeah. So you mentioned when you got that grant, you had thought maybe this is going to help shift your career in this direction, but obviously you ended up switching focus. So how did that happen?
So to be honest, I think I never really wanted to study drug and alcohol effects on the brain. OHSU has a fantastic program, probably one of the best in the nations to understand risk for alcohol and drug abuse and or consequences of that. And it's a great topic. I didn't want to download all those papers and read them. That's not where I found myself going. And so the exercise stuff was interesting. I personally think it would be useful to know for daily life if that would be more useful for brain development. But I just kind of felt like I wanted to study more about just individuals in general. And so that's when I took a postdoctoral fellowship at the Children's Hospital of LA in 2012. And the whole reason I took that position was because they were starting to do longitudinal MRI, so more than one time point. And I really just thought the future of what we're going to know about people is studying the same people over time and their individual variability. And so I hopped on that opportunity to learn that skill set so that I could have it in my back pocket later on in my career.
Definitely. So is working with Children's Hospital, which is affiliated with USC, what eventually led to this faculty position?
Yeah. So I was a postdoc for 4 years. And then I took some advice from my sister who's not in academia. And I said, what am I going to do? I'm applying for these jobs. I'm not getting much interest. And I don't think it's because I'm not competitive. Like, it's just really hard out there. What should I do? And she said, well, why don't you go start just getting coffee with people? So maybe kind of like this podcast. Why don't you just start getting to know people and what they're doing? And then maybe, people say jobs come through networking. So I started to have what was like cold emails to people at UCLA and USC and others to just say, this is who I am. I would love to talk to you about what you're doing and where you got to where you are, right? And sure enough, in that process, I reached out to someone at USC who had just started a new birth cohort called the Madre study, where they were studying Latino women, Latin women from LA, and they were going to study them while they were pregnant and then give birth. I obviously study older children, but I thought, wow, what a cool idea to be studying, Hispanic women in LA and following them and their kind of exposure to the environment. And so I went and chatted with them. And then I didn't even know it. They said, oh, you know what? We have a job opening. And I was like, you do? And they were like, yeah, you should consider applying if you're really interested in maybe thinking about environment and child brain development. And so I went home and I applied. So I never would have looked for a job in the Department of Preventive Medicine. I was looking for psychology and neuroscience. I wasn't looking broader than that.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that. But also, this just reminded me, since you were applying for professor jobs, obviously if you want to work in academia and keep doing research like you were doing, then you become a professor. But actually, in my intro for you, I stumbled. I almost said research professor because my last interview was with a research professor. But you not only do research, but you teach. So I wanted to ask you about your teaching experience, either during grad school or during your postdoc, and if there was anything about that drew you to wanting to be a professor as opposed to just doing research.
Yeah, that's a great question. OHSU is a medical school, so we didn't have to do TA-ships. Those were voluntary. And so in my latter years, because I wanted to get that experience, I partnered with a couple of different professors in nearby colleges to teach a lecture here or there, and then co-taught a course for grad students actually on fMRI applied to like clinical neuropsychology with my mentor at the time. So I helped develop the course and teach all the lectures. And I liked teaching. I think there's something really rewarding about continuing to see the world through different perspectives. And one of that is research. You meet other research scientists. The other side of that's your personal life. But I think students have a lot to offer in terms of what they're thinking about, how they grew up, their perspective on some of the work and the knowledge that exists or doesn't exist. And so I just think it makes it for a more well-rounded experience to think about your work, both is it useful for people to know about it? Because if the next generation really doesn't care about it, then how useful is it going to be? And then also, can you continue to learn from all of them in terms of the ways that you maybe haven't looked or thought about something?
Mm-hmm. So getting this new appointment in the Department of Preventive Medicine, obviously your research, you got to stay focused on neuro, which is great, but now you're also teaching kids, and I'm guessing you're not teaching neuroscience classes, you're teaching in preventive medicine, right? So was that a shock?
So I was lucky enough that they let me develop a course with another professor who came in around the same time as me. And we got to develop a course that, you're right, it's in health promotion. So something weird about USC is that I need to teach in the department I'm employed.
Yeah.
So here I am, a neuroscience major. I could probably teach some psychology. I definitely could teach neuroscience. But I needed to teach something, and I would not say I'm an expert at environment by any means. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist that works with other environmental scientists. So what we did is we partnered together, and we now teach a class. I think it's in year 4. And it's doing pretty well. It's an undergrad class. And what we do is we talk about the environment, and that's Dr. Ferzahn's part of the course, where she tells us, where are these chemicals found, what's in air pollution, how are different communities affected by this. And then I remind people of neurobiology, the cells in our brains, and also how to measure it with MRI. And then we talk about the literature. What do we know so far? What don't we know? And that's been really fun, because that is my area that we focus on. And so it really couldn't have been done, though, without 2 professors. There wasn't anyone to teach that whole class. So that's been really fun.
Yeah, that sounds like a great collaboration. So what year did you start your professor position here?
Summer of 2016.
Okay. So the reason I ask is you sent me 2 papers, one's 2020, one's 2021, and we'll get to those, but those are a bit newer. So what happened between 2016 and then? Anything noteworthy?
Yeah, we've done a lot as a lab, small but mighty, and now we're rather large. Um, we've published a number of things on individual differences in brain development, and longitudinal data with some collaborators internationally. We've done some work on looking at various sex steroids. So, we have a study of some data looking at typically developing healthy adolescents. We also have some subpopulations, such as kids with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. The kids have a genetic abnormality where they can't make cortisol correctly, and so they have a number of other hormones that get altered. And so we've been studying them and published some work on them. We really just continue to look at sex differences, sex steroids, and a number of individual differences in brain maturation. So we've had quite a bit go on. But yeah, the 2 papers I sent you were more recent, because that is kind of where we're headed, I think.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about that. So the first one was the ABCD air pollution study. And so I am in your lab, and I still don't know that much about ABCD, to be frank, and I'm sure any listeners might not either. So could you go over what the ABCD study is, and then also how you got involved in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So ABCD stands for the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. And this was an initiative, I want to say 2014, 2015, where NIH decided, right, the big funder for federal research, that they wanted to do a large study of brain development across the US. And some studies like this had been done to some degree in Europe, like the Imogen study happened years before, where they were looking at kids, adolescents in Paris and Germany and a couple of other sites. But this was going to be the first one in the United States of America. And they wanted to have many people apply. So they wanted groups of people to kind of work together and submit, how they, what their protocol might look like to scan a bunch of children across the US and study brain development. And again, going back how small life is sometimes, this was primarily funded originally by NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, right? Back to this work of risk for drug abuse. And they were specifically interested because, you know, marijuana laws are changing. Obviously, we know children start to use alcohol and other drugs during adolescence commonly. And so they wanted to kind of study individuals and how they grow up for 10 years. And so they wanted to recruit 9 to 10-year-olds. They wanted it to be mostly representative of the United States. And they wanted all the people who've been studying brain development to put in an application, and they were going to select the people they wanted to kind of run this study.
You could say best.
I was lucky enough to be a postdoctoral fellow at the time in Elizabeth Sowell's lab at CHLA, where I'm still affiliated, and helped write the application for that study. And so she was awarded one of the 21 sites that became the ABCD study. And so its conception was in 2016, they started enrolling 11,880 9 to 10-year-olds across the US, and they tried their best to make it as representative of all the 9 to 10-year-olds in America. Now, given those 21 sites are pretty big urban areas, so you are missing some rural areas, and you definitely don't have all the demographics, but they tried their best and with the researchers and the MRI machines that were available. And so I was lucky enough to be a co-I on that study, and then more recently became a co-PI, which means I help co-lead the CHLA site. And so ABCD is really exciting because for the first time, not only are we studying individual differences of the same kids over a 10-year period, but we also have so much information on them from their social environments, their school environments, how they feel and think, what their parents think they feel and think, where they stand in their pubertal maturation, how they do on some cognitive tests, what their brain structure and brain function look like. Essentially, if you can think of it, it probably exists in the data set. So we're talking thousands of variables. And these wonderful children and parents who have signed up come back on an annual basis, and they get their brain scanned every 2 years.
Yeah, I was blown away by that, by, a sample size of 10 or 11,000 and getting MRIs, and they're all kids. And, I had an MRI a couple months ago, and it was pretty cool, but I don't know if I'd want to do it again every year, especially if I was a kid. So props to them.
Yeah. I mean, I think it helps, everyone who's part of this consortium has been studying child and adolescent brain development for a long time. I'm probably one of the most junior again. And so, we did half-hour sessions, if they couldn't do a full hour. We definitely had movies showing during the scans where we're not looking at brain function, so they could watch, Finding Nemo or whatever video would keep them holding still. But it's a lot, the whole visit I think can last up to 8 hours of being in the lab doing tests, and so it wouldn't be possible without all of those that volunteer, and so that's pretty incredible. It's an incredible study. So the paper that came of it is because I became very interested when I joined environmental health in our current department, in studying the environment. And one of the things that we are really good at USC is studying air pollution. And I didn't know this until, I had those cups of coffee with all those professors. But we've been studying air pollution and its effects on lung function and body mass index and all of these things, and have really helped clean up the air in LA. Like, that research has literally been used in policy for EPA and other standards. And so was very excited to think about if we could see if whether or not, even with the improvements we've made, does air pollution matter in terms of brain development and using ABCD. So I co-chair, across the entire consortium, how we think about environment and how we can link that to where people live. And so this paper was just that. It was looking at one type of air pollution called fine particulate matter, which are these very, very small particles and gases, and how that may relate to brain structure, and found some interesting patterns where higher air pollution was linked to not only decreases in brain volume, which maybe people would have hypothesized as being bad, but also in some regions increases. And what I think is going on is that the brain goes through a pruning process. So you kind of increase the number of synapses and you have more connections and more volumes, and then you prune. And so maybe, just maybe, air pollution might influence the microglial cells in our brain, which are involved with the pruning process. And so now we have grants to follow them longitudinally to see if the trajectories of brain maturation matter.
Yeah, when reading that, I was wondering, I mean, air pollution obviously sounds bad, but seeing that it didn't seem like, decreased volumes across the board as if it's impeding your brain development. It seemed like things were maybe just being shifted around, like decreases in some areas, increases in others. And then you also mentioned that there were no differences in cognitive performance. So I was wondering, are these structural differences that you found, do you have reason to believe that they're harmful? Or does it seem like it's somehow your brain is reorganizing itself in response to the environment?
Yeah, it's really an interesting question, and I don't think we'll know yet. So one thing, right, is we took a single snapshot of both air pollution 1 year prior to when they got their brain scanned. And then we took a single snapshot of what their brain looked like to 9 to 10-year-olds. And like you said, maybe there's just a rearrangement. So we know the brain is sensitive at different time periods to different things. And we know different systems are more malleable. Think about language. I can't learn Spanish for the life of me. I've been trying forever and I can't, right? Maybe if I would have just learned as a kid, it would have been easier. So part of me thinks that it could be that there's just sensitive periods of which brain system is being remodeled, that air pollution matters. And so that our grants that we have now should answer that eventually. And it will look at air pollution exposure from where they lived when they were born all the way up until we stopped the study. And I don't know about the effects. I think people wanted, other research has shown cognitive effects. And either maybe the air pollution levels are low in America, and maybe at higher levels you would see the cognitive effects others have seen. Or maybe, the cognitive effects don't come on until later. Or maybe there's compensatory mechanisms. I think one thing I always remember from my time in reading the literature from animals, which I still do very actively, and being part of those labs, is how malleable the brain is. So compensation, I think, is real. And so I think time will tell if it's meaningful for function, but it definitely seems like structurally there might be something going on, which you will have to find out if whether or not it links to everybody's everyday life.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting. So you mentioned that USC has been a leading institution for research on air pollution, and that this research has directly impacted, like, I don't know, air pollution laws in maybe LA or California. So are you most interested in this topic theoretically, as in like, wow, here are some ways that the brain can be affected during development? That's so cool. Or is it more of like a, wow, we need to do everything we can to make sure that we're not harming developing brains? And so it's more of like a theoretical versus an intervention type motivation, or is it both?
So I would definitely say my research until the last 5-6 years was definitely oh, that's so cool. But I feel that when I came across environmental neuroscience, which really is where the lab kind of fits as part of what we do, which is an emerging field, is like there's real policy implications. And I think it's, when I started to learn about the environment, air pollution was just one, right? There's all these chemicals in our foods. There's all these chemicals in what we wash our faces with. There's environmental injustice. So maybe another thing that really played a role is, I live in Boyle Heights, where my partner was born and raised. And we found out a couple of years ago about the Exide plant. Have you heard about the Exide plant?
No.
So the Exide plant was this battery recycling plant in LA. It's in East LA. And they were like taking old car batteries and melting them down, essentially to get rid of them. So it was a smelter plant. And it had essentially been running without valid permits for 30 years, polluting the entire environment around East LA. So Downey, Bell Gardens, parts of Boyle Heights. So much so that they started testing the soil of people's homes and finding essentially toxic waste level of lead and arsenic and other chemicals.
Wow.
And so, this was eye-opening. It was already eye-opening when you read about it, but it was eye-opening that I was living, essentially in the old place we were living in toxic waste level, and community. I'd go to the community member boards where the people who were supposed to clean it up, really were like, oh yeah, and the community was like, hey, this has been going on forever. When can we get some justice around here? And so I think things like that also, like here, maybe in addition to like the air is bad for everyone in LA, like maybe we can also show how bad this is and then maybe rectify, especially for the communities that have been hit the hardest from some of this decision making that was out of, our control as everyday citizens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so your research can have real policy implications.
I mean, mine hasn't so far, but yeah, I think it can.
Will.
I think the environmental neuroscience, people should care that air pollution impacts lungs and asthma, and they should care that it might increase our risk of obesity. But I feel like neuroscience has always been a sexy topic. And if people can realize it could influence our brains, maybe people will start to care. Maybe.
Yeah, why do you think that is? That neuroscience seems sexier than biology?
I don't know. It's just, do you have any theories on that?
I don't know. I mean, it could be like almost a narcissistic thing. Like, wow, if my brain causes me to do everything I do, then I'm more interested in that than my silly little body.
Yeah.
I wonder if that'll happen with like AI and stuff, or if we ever reach the level of being able to upload our consciousness into a computer, if we'll stop caring about neuro and only care about the newest simulation.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember distinctly in interviewing for grad school, I interviewed in one, and I can't even remember what place it was. And the professor asked me, he was an MD, PhD, and he said, why do you really care about the brain? Like the brain only works in context of the whole body. And I was like probably 20. I went right through. So I didn't take any time out. I was really young and I was like, no, the brain controls everything. What are you talking about? Like the brain stem and like all the things we do subconsciously, it's definitely about the brain. That's why I want to study the brain. And now thinking back to air pollution, these other chemicals and what I know about neuroendocrine function and all of this, he was so right. Like the brain is connected to the rest of the body. And so if your lungs and your heart are being affected by air pollution, well, your heart and your oxygen levels also are what require the brain to work. So it's almost like it's funny that neuroscience is so sexy because I think we're going to find out in the next decade system links and how, it's not just the brain, right? People are starting to put the gut with the brain, right? They're starting, I think there'll be more with the heart in the brain and the lungs in the brain. And then the question is, which one becomes sick first and or do they become sick together? But I think it's going to be really interesting when we start, stop studying things as like separate organs and we start to kind of go back to, Eastern medicine. It's all connected, right?
Right. Yeah, that I just started reading Descartes' Error by Dr. Damasio here at USC, and he talks about how reason isn't just produced objectively by the brain, it's influenced by emotion, and emotion isn't just produced by the brain, it's influenced by the entire body. And I've heard he's doing some new stuff with how your gut microbiome might influence your brain.
Yeah. I remember learning about emotional theory, right? One is like, do you have top down of emotion, right? You think you experience something and then you feel it, or is it bottom up? Do you feel the arousal, your heart race, all of these like sensory inputs that then tell your brain you're having an emotion. And I don't think we know the answer still, right? It's probably some combination of both, but that was really eye-opening to think like emotion could be all your body. If you could just stop it in your body, maybe you could stop it in your brain. But
It seems like the number one answer to any scientific question when it's phrased as either or is it's probably some combination of both.
Yeah. That's how you always in your discussion in your paper, okay? It's probably both.
Mhm. Okay, so do you want to talk about Claire, one of your grad students' new paper?
Sure.
Okay, so from what I understood, you looked at you were able to divide the amygdala into 9 subregions and look at structural differences in those subregions in adolescence, and you found some sex differences.
Yes. Yeah. So I think one of the things, in addition to wanting to understand individual differences and wanting to study the environment, is that, also, I think everybody who's a scientist, they want to also use the most accurate and new methods to do so. And so one of the things that we had done, or I had done personally, is I always looked at the amygdala, which I didn't, I used to be a hippocampus person. I like the hippocampus, especially with exercise, hippocampus. And then early on in my postdoc, I found some interesting results with the total amygdala and testosterone, and thought, what is the amygdala even doing? And of course, I remember from the animal literature, when you talk to people about the amygdala that study this at the level of cellular, molecular, there's so many things going on, right? There's so many microcircuits that are controlling the, classical conditioning, or even, looking at some papers, you can lesion parts of the amygdala and you get fat rats, right? So there's a lot going on in the amygdala. And so I started to think, how could we better look at the amygdala? We can look at total volume, but maybe we're missing something. And at that point, I had been introduced to Mike Tyszka, who is at Caltech. And he had kind of come up with a new way to kind of segment the amygdala in vivo. And this is exciting me because there were other ways people had used, but they were mostly based on like a handful of old males. So like a lot of the atlases were based on like 10 men who are over the age of 70, which is not really representative of the developing brain. And so this was exciting that he had created a way to segment the amygdala using in vivo imaging like we do, and do it in part of the Human Connectome project, so this large scale study. And he used, young adults, so 18, to 25, which is much closer to what we're studying. And so I said, I would love to know what's going on with amygdala in an adolescent sample. And I didn't have access to a longitudinal data set, but I had access to my old mentor, Bonnie Nagel, up at OHSU, that wonderful mentor that didn't let me quit. And I knew she had 400 adolescents because I had scanned a lot of them when I was a grad student, right? Mm-hmm. And I said, you have a great resource, and I think it'd be really cool if we did this, atlas and looked at the amygdala in this, these 400 kids you've scanned already. And she said, great. And she said, go write a grant. She didn't say, I want to write a grant. She said, that's a great idea. You should run with it. So I wrote a grant. And she was very nice. She just was like, here's my data that I worked, my whole career to put together. And Mike Tyszka was like, here's my atlas. Let me know how I can help. And so Claire in the lab really took that project and ran with it. And yeah, we saw in these 400-ish adolescents that if you segment that amygdala, it looks slightly different when you're 10 versus 17 in boys in terms of the composition, what proportion of each nuclei takes up the amygdala, but not in girls or females. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting. And now she has some work that's about to go out for a review, trying to understand both testosterone levels that were collected in a subset, as well as their androgen receptor sensitivity. So genetic differences in a functional polymorphism for how sensitive your body is to testosterone. And so she's finding some interesting associations with that as well, using this kind of similar approach of the amygdala.
That's really cool. So is the general goal with subdividing these regions to see which specific regions are associated with what behaviors or functions?
Yeah, down the road, that is our goal. So the interesting thing about the 400 individuals from Bonnie Nagel's lab was that they all came from different studies. So she does great phenotyping, and by phenotyping I mean behavioral testing on these kids. But because so many of them came from different studies, the imaging sequence was the same, but not all the behavioral sequences were the same. And so we didn't have the same amount of power to say, does this relate to function in emotion or other behaviors? And so that's something I'd really like to do. I'd like to replicate this at some point. I'd like to study people longitudinally to see if we really do see individual differences and kind of, the morphology of the amygdala. And then more importantly, does that at all relate to behavior? And we don't have the data set picked out yet to do that, but I think, that will be important.
Yeah, fingers crossed for that. So I wanted to ask you about these, are you more of a visual learner, or do you learn by like words and associations, especially with regards to like making sure or learning what specific brain regions do? Do you picture it in your mind and then you match the picture to the function, or is it just like the word will bring up other words?
Oh, interesting. I've never thought of that. I guess I like in my head picture the brain, and then I just picture whatever function I've associated with it.
Yeah. So the reason I ask is because, especially while reading Claire's paper, it's like amygdala, great. That's one of the first things you learn about. So it's not too hard to imagine. But the subregions, I feel like unless you spend your whole career looking at this one specific brain area, you probably won't memorize what these different subregions are doing, unless you're just taking notes on it. And it seems like the broader you go, the easier it is to do. But I was wondering, if I say something like parahippocampal gyrus, does that actually bring forth a specific area in mind for you? Or is it more like what happens for me is like, oh yeah, this is an area associated with the hippocampus and memory, but I can't get any more specific than that unless I open up a textbook.
Yeah, I think I'm the latter. I think it's hard for me once you start to segment into many regions to really retain the specificity, unless I'm working on a project with those regions and I'm refreshing what exactly they do. But I feel like maybe that's because I'm not a neuroanatomist, because I swear the neuroanatomists who have essentially take their whole career defining each region, they probably, functional neuroanatomists, not just they probably have them down packed. But yeah, I think you have a great point, which is Claire didn't do this for her paper that just was published, but this next one, I had her create a 3D replication of these regions and map her results to a picture, because I too was like, even in my head, and I know I wrote the grant, I worked with her on this paper for the last couple of years. I still would be like, wait, that one's the most lateral, that's the most medial, is that the one that makes up the bigger BLA group? Like it was just like I needed the visual to make it more concrete. And so her next paper has that, but we really should have done that for that paper, because I'm with you. As soon as you start getting smaller and smaller, the harder it is to tangibly wrap your head around not only where are they located, but their potential functional implications.
Right. And it's definitely reassuring to hear that's coming even from you. So yeah.
I don't know, ask some more professors. I bet some of them, they're like, oh yeah, I memorized all of those regions.
I will ask. So it's funny because this is usually the part where I'll ask about ongoing and future work, but the nature of your research is that so much of it is longitudinal, or so much of it is just these giant data sets that are waiting to be analyzed. So it's like it's the same project, just from different angles.
Yeah, I think so. I think some of the exciting things are, looking at different brain modalities. So both those papers were looking at brain structure. And I actually didn't start that type of work until I was a postdoc. I'm much more focused on white matter microstructure with diffusion methodology and functional MRI as a trainee, as a PhD student. And so I'm very much looking forward to jumping into that work, because we do have multimodal, as we call it, in these studies. And one thing I always laughed about, I still think people say I'm multimodal and then they just publish structure and function. As a field, I still think we have a lot of work to do to look at networks and not regions, and then also integrate them. So if there really are these structural differences with air pollution, or structural differences with with gray matter in the amygdala, I would assume that the systems that are at play would also be altered, the way they're connected, the way that they function. And so I think that I'd like to see our lab take the next step in the next 5 years and really start to be some of the great leaders, or at least just try to integrate them, right? Try to say something more than just the size of smaller or bigger, and really start to work with integrating the modalities in a meaningful way. And so people are using machine learning, people are using, other methods of like graph theory to look at networks and hubs and edges. These things have been going on for a while, but I'd like to see those be applied to some of the work in sex differences, in functional endocrinology, in environmental neuroscience. And so, I don't think we're going to recreate the wheel. These people are already doing this, these methods exist, but I'd like to see them be applied to how we answer our questions in a more thorough way.
Mm-hmm. Those definitely sound like great future directions for the field at large. What about the general public? Do you feel that there's anything that you either think the general public is lacking about neuroscience education, or things you wish would be focused on more, or just things you want to get out there?
I think all of us that are in science, there's still a push, but I think we need to do a better job of like actually making our results and what we do tangible to the everyday person. And I think that could come in a lot of different ways, and maybe we, as a field could brainstorm. So part of like, for example, one thing I love to show students in class are these videos called 2-minute neuroscience. Have you seen those?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, so I love those. I don't know who that guy is. I should probably reach out to him and tell him like I literally watch all his videos. But it takes, and even those are not as lay as I'm thinking for the general public, but it takes really concept or really complicated subjects and can literally explain them, like Reddit's Explain It Like I'm Five, and help people out. Like these don't, and it's not just words, not, you asked if I was like visual or verbal. I think I'm both, but reading textbooks, some of those things are really dense. And even our papers, as you started with, are really hard. Can't we help like the whole human existence to share what we're learning in a way that's, here we are, like some of the leading scientists around the world doing really cool stuff, but we can't explain what we do to the regular everyday person. Like, and we are everyday people, right? Like I'm an everyday person. So the fact, like, if I can explain it to my parents and my aunts and uncles, which I can, then why don't we have a focus and are paid and prioritized to be able to share things more with people at that level? And so I think just in general, educating people on the scientific process, the importance of research. What is research? I was fortunate to go to school and learn what research and then get hands-on experience. But I have feelings there's millions and millions of Americans and elsewhere that don't really know what research means. And I think it'd be useful for us to let them know what that means.
Right. Not only spreading out that information and making it more digestible, but making sure it stays accurate. I think I saw one example, and it was kind of a spoof of how much a media article twisted a scientific article. From what I remember, it was something like one small part of an article said like, we found a small association between like, I don't know, chocolate consumption and some type of cancer. And then one media article reports it as association found between chocolate and cancer. And then another cites that one and says, chocolate causes cancer. And then like it breaks into the tabloid, breaking news, chocolate causes cancer, or something like that.
It's like the telephone game.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Whisper something and it changes.
We need to stop playing telephone with science.
Yeah, well, that's also the hard thing, right? It's like, I think schools and academic institutions want people to do really fancy work and get recognized for that fancy work. If chocolate does relate to cancer, they want to be the first ones to hear about it, and they want every news media to cover it. Maybe not right now, there's a pandemic, but in general, they want their research to be known. And so I think sometimes, and for me, it's difficult because I don't know how to upsell my work. I'm always like, well, we don't really know, and like people
Yeah.
are, that's not what they want to hear. They want to hear X relates to Z or Y first.
Mhm.
And so I also think, again, if we just educated people on the scientific process and what we do know and what we don't know, maybe that would help. Or maybe it would just make people lose faith in science because we don't know that much, right?
Mhm.
But at least we would educate people about the process so that maybe, yeah, maybe they would be useful. But in terms of how to make sure that stuff doesn't get twisted and turned into a new meaning, man, who knows? The internet is crazy these days.
Yeah, it seems like one solution, but it has a huge flaw, is long form discussion like this, unedited, not boiled down into like superficial headlines. But the problem is no one has time for that. You don't even have time to read like studies in your field, let alone, all of science.
Recently, through some work we've been doing at the consortium level to think about justice and equity and diversity and inclusion, is talking about urgency in science and urgency in general. How people are so quick to try to publish so they have that or add to their CV, and how more importantly than any of that is the process, right? Is like
Hmm.
the actual process, and if people found value in the process, like this, the process of sitting down, process of having a cup of coffee with a scientist, whatever you want to do, right? Like that is where real learning and education and change probably happens. The publications are probably the end point, and yeah, it's nice for grants and it's nice for recognition, but the process, people should appreciate the process more. And so I think that's why I was happy to join you today, because I think the process of talking about research, about talking about how people got to where they are, is probably equally as meaningful for that person and hopefully others than just the list of publications or whatever's listed on their website. It's like the process of becoming a scientist or the process of doing science is so much more meaningful.
Absolutely. And I hope that view becomes more widespread. So I think this is a great place to stop. Dr. Herting, thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Thanks, Adam.
Great.